On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was officially dissolved, and with that, the Cold War ended. Or so we thought. When Gorbachev resigned, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. 15 independent republics emerged overnight. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, Central Asian republics, and others. The US found itself in an interesting position, the sole superpower on Earth with no rival. Some intellectuals, like Francis Fukuyama, famously declared it, quote, the end of history, end quote, meaning liberal democracy had won, and great power competition was essentially over. There was a euphoria in Washington. The question became not how did we contain Russia, but what to do with all this power. But while America was celebrating, Russia was in chaos. The economy was already in a bad shape before the collapse. But after the collapse, their GDP shrank dramatically through the 90s. Life expectancy dropped, organized crime and oligarchs carved up state assets in what became known as, quote, the wild 90s, end quote. Boris Yeltsin was leading a country that had gone from superpower to basket case almost overnight. Russia still had thousands of nuclear weapons, but was militarily and economically crippled. NATO was a military alliance built specifically to counter the Soviet Union. When the USSR dissolved, a logical question arose. Does NATO even need to exist anymore? Gorbachev and later Russian leaders claimed they received verbal assurances from Western leaders that NATO would not expand eastward into former Soviet territory. The West has largely disputed this. Whether those assurances were real or not become one of the most contested diplomatic questions over the next 3 decades. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia had been Soviet satellite states for decades. In 1991, they were free, and many of them desperately wanted to join NATO and the EU, understandably given their history of being dominated by Moscow. This created an immediate tension. The West saw expansion as spreading democracy and security, while Russia saw it as encirclement. The other player on the world stage was China. In 1991, China was still relatively poor and not yet seen as a major rival, but had survived the Tiananmen Square crackdown in '89, and they were quietly building their economy that would eventually make it America's primary geopolitical concern. To better understand the situation is to think of it like this. Imagine there is no world government. No authority sits above nation states that can enforce rules, punish aggression, or guarantee anyone's safety. The United Nations can pass resolutions, but it has no army. International law exists, but there's nobody to enforce it. This condition is what political analysts call anarchy. Not chaos in the everyday sense, but a system with no central authority. And this single fact explains most of everything about how great powers behave. Think about what this meant in 1991. The Soviet Union just collapsed. Russia still had thousands of nuclear warheads, a massive military, and was in complete political turmoil. Nobody knew who was really in control. The US was a sole superpower, but it couldn't simply order Russia to behave. There was no mechanism to guarantee that. That's the anarchy we have in this scenario. To understand this theory, you need to understand the mechanisms that drive them. The first one being, great powers inherently possess some offensive military power. What this means is every major nation has the ability to hurt other nations. This isn't about intention, it's just a fact of military reality. A country with an army that can use that army to make demands. The next one is states or nations can never be certain about the intentions of other states. Even if Russia says it's peaceful today, you can never be 100% certain it will be peaceful tomorrow. Leadership changes, circumstances changes. You simply cannot see inside other governments' decision-making with perfect clarity. Another is pretty simple, which is the primary goal of great powers, which is to survive. Above anything else, states want to continue existing. A state that ceases to exist can no longer pursue any of its other goals. But the biggest driving factor behind these nations is fear, specifically fear of other great powers. Here's the idea. You can't verify other nations' intentions with certainty. They have military power that could harm you. There's no authority to protect you if they decide to use it. Therefore, you must always be prepared for the possibility that they will. Now apply this to Russia in 1991. Russia looks at NATO, a military alliance that spent 40 years preparing to fight them, and asks, why does it still exist if the threat is gone? The US looks at Russia thinking they have the world's second largest nuclear arsenal, massive territory, and history of expansionism, and they ask themselves, how do we know this democratic nation will stick? Both sides are afraid. Neither side is necessarily lying about wanting peace, but the structure of the system guarantees suspicion regardless. Since survival is the top priority and fear is constant, states have a powerful incentive to maximize their power, not just to maintain it, More power means more security. The safest possible nation is to be so powerful that no other state would even think to attack you. This is offensive realism. Some realists argue states only seek enough power to defend themselves, and then they're satisfied once they feel secure. But this isn't necessarily true. The logic of the system pushes states towards seeking dominance because you can never be quite sure how much is enough. The ultimate prize is regional hegemony, being so dominant in your geographical region that no rival can challenge you. We can use the United States as an example. By the Monroe Doctrine era, the US systematically pushed European powers out of the Western Hemisphere, not because Europe was attacking, but because having potential rivals close by was inherently dangerous. Once the US achieved regional hegemony in the Americas, it then focused on preventing any other state from doing the same in Europe or Asia. That's why the US got involved in both world wars, and why it maintained troops in Europe and Asia long after the Cold War ended. One of the most important concepts to understand is the security dilemma. When one state builds up its military to feel more secure, neighboring states see that buildup and feel less secure. So they build up too. The first state then sees that buildup and feels threatened again. The cycle escalates even though nobody made an aggressive move. This is very relevant to understanding Russia and NATO after 1991. As NATO expanded eastward, bringing in Poland in 1999 and the Baltic states in 2004, Russia saw a military alliance moving closer to its borders. NATO members argued they were simply helping new democracies feel secure. But from Moscow's perspective, the security dilemma was playing out in textbook fashion. Each decisive move by the West looked like an offensive threat from the East, and vice versa. Perhaps the most counterintuitive argument is that the intentions of states matter far less than their capabilities. Even if every American president from Bush to Clinton to Obama genuinely had no interest in threatening Russia, Russia cannot simply take that good faith indefinitely. What matters is what America could do with its power, and that scenario never goes away. For example, whether or not James Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO wouldn't expand almost doesn't matter at the structural level. The capability was always going to be there. The fear was always going to be rational. The situation is tragic not because anyone is evil, but because the structure of the international system, such as anarchy, uncertainty, military power, and the survival instinct, makes conflict and competition essentially unavoidable. States that genuinely want peace still end up locked in arms races and rivalries because the alternative, which is trusting completely in another state's goodwill, is simply too dangerous when your existence as a nation is on the line. The next term to understand is power. People throw it around constantly: American power, Russian power, and Chinese power, without being precise about what they mean. Is it military strength, economic size, population, technology, or cultural influence? This sloppy understanding leads to bad analysis and worse policy. But when it comes to great power competition, military power is the ultimate currency. Not economic power, not soft power, not diplomatic influence. Military force, or the credible threat of it, is what ultimately determines outcomes between great powers. This is different from a lot of Cold War thinking, which emphasized economic interdependence, international institutions, and democratic norms as the new foundation of global order. Latent power is the underlying socio-economic base a state can draw on to build military strength. This includes GDP, population size, technology capability, industrial base, and natural resources. It's the raw materials of power. Military power is the actual armed forces a state fields, its armies, navies, air force, and nuclear arsenal. The relationship between the two is critical. Latent power doesn't automatically translate into military power, but over time it tends to. A state with enormous latent power, a huge economy, large population, and advanced technology has the potential to become a dominant military force, even if it isn't one right now. An example of this would be China in 2001. When China was still far behind the US militarily, China's latent power projected it forward. Now apply this to Russia after 1991. Russia lost enormous latent power when the Soviet Union collapsed. It shed 14 republics, lost access to key industrial regions in Ukraine and the Baltics, and saw its GDP fall through the 90s. This is why Russia couldn't effectively project military power during that decade. The chaos in Chechnya in 1994 to 1996, where a relatively small separatist force humiliated the Russian army, was a direct consequence of this latent power collapse. But the underlying geography, natural resources, particularly oil and gas, and nuclear arsenal meant the latent power was never truly gone. It was waiting for the right conditions to be rebuilt. But wealth in a state does matter. Wealthy states have massive military advantages over poor ones, not just because they can buy more weapons, but because of their technology. Advanced economies produce cutting-edge military technology. The Gulf War in 1991 had just demonstrated this vividly. American precision-guided munitions, stealth aircraft, and real-time battlefield communications utterly overwhelmed a large but technologically inferior Iraqi militarily. Wealth buys the R&D that produces the advantages. Rich states can also sustain prolonged conflicts. They can absorb losses, replace equipment, and maintain troop morale in ways that poor states simply cannot. And wars of attrition tend to favor the wealthier combatant. Deploying military force far from your borders is expensive. Aircraft carriers, global logistic chains, and overseas bases, these require deep economic resources. The U.S. ability to project power globally is inseparable from its economic dominance, and wealthy states can attract allies and can afford to subsidize them. NATO worked partly because the U.S. was economically powerful enough to bear a disproportionate share of the alliance's cost. Large populations provide two critical military advantages. First one, they produce larger potential armies. A state with 300 million people has a larger manpower pool than one with 30 million. Second, large populations generally produce large economies, which feeds back into latent power. But population alone isn't enough. It has to be a productive population. An historic case where large populations didn't translate into great power status because the economic and technological base wasn't there to harness the human capital effectively was China in the 19th century. They had the world's largest population, but was repeatedly humiliated by smaller but technologically superior European powers. That population was latent power that couldn't be converted into military effectiveness without the right economic and technological infrastructure. This has direct relevance to the Russia-American comparison. The US has a significant population advantage over Russia and a much larger economy. Russia's great power status rested heavily on its nuclear arsenal and geographic mass rather than economic or demographic dominance. When the Soviet economy system collapsed, it exposed how much of the Soviet power had been artificially sustained. There was also an economic Cold War theory. The argument is if America and Russian businesses are deeply intertwined, if trade flows create mutual dependencies, then both sides have too much to lose from a conflict. Commerce would essentially replace war. But this theory fails because there was a time in history where this didn't work. In pre-World War I Europe, as a historical case, in 1914, Europe was more economically interdependent than it had ever been. Britain and Germany were major trading partners. Capital flowed freely across borders. International businesses connections were deep and dense. Many observers at the time believed war had become economically irrational and therefore impossible. Then came the most catastrophic war in human history up to that point. When survival and core security interests are at stake, states will accept enormous economic cost rather than submit to a rival's dominance. Economic interdependence can raise the cost of conflict, but it cannot override the fundamental security logic. When push comes to shove, guns defeat trade. This is a deeply relevant argument for understanding the post-Cold War period. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Western policymakers believed that integrating Russia into the global economy through trade, investment, and institutions would moderate Russian behavior and eventually make conflict unthinkable. Germany became heavily dependent on Russian natural gas. Western companies invested in Russian energy. The theory was that this web of economic connections would bind Russia into the Western order. What actually happened is that Russia used those economic connections as leverage, particularly the gas pipelines to Europe, while simultaneously rebuilding its military capacity with oil revenues and pursuing what it considered its vital security interests regardless of economic cost. When the crunch came in Ukraine, Europe discovered it had made itself dependent on a rival rather than transforming that rival into an ally. But war in this century is very different from the past because of nuclear weapons. They are unlike any other military asset. They represent such overwhelming destructive potential that no rational state would deliberately invite a nuclear strike by attacking a nuclear-armed rival directly. But nuclear weapons are essentially defensive tools. They deter accidental attacks on the state that possesses them. What they cannot do is be used to compel other states to do what you want in day-to-day competition. They're too extreme for anything other than existential threats in theory. This means that below the nuclear threshold, conventional military power still matters enormously. States can compete, contest territory, support proxies, apply pressure, and even fight limited wars without triggering nuclear escalation. And in that space, conventional military power remains decisive. This framework explains a lot of post-Cold War behavior. Russia couldn't be pushed around on existential issues because its nuclear arsenal remained intact, even through the chaos of the 90s. But in conventional terms, NATO's expansion was a real shift in the balance of power that Russia lacked the military strength to counter during that decade. Only after rebuilding its economy and military through the 2000s did Russia begin pushing back conventionally, in Georgia in 2008 and in Ukraine in 2014. If you define the Cold War purely as an ideological conflict between communism and capitalism, then yes, it ended in 1991. Communism as a governing ideology collapsed. But if you use another framework, looking at latent power, military capacity, geography, and the fundamental competition those generate, the picture looks very different. Russia never lost its nuclear arsenal. It never lost its geographic mass. Even after the collapse, they still are one of the biggest nations on Earth. They never lost their energy resources. The latent power was temporarily suppressed by economic chaos, but the underlying foundations were always there. As soon as Russia rebuilt its economy base in the 2000s under Putin, the structural conditions for great power competition reasserted themselves. From this perspective, the 90s weren't the end of the rivalry. They were a temporary pause forced on Russia by circumstances during which the US and NATO made moves, particularly expansion, that guaranteed the competition would resume the moment Russia recovered the capacity to contest them. A component to understand about military power is land power, specifically armies, which is the most important form of military power in great power competition, not navies or air force. States are controlled by governments. Governments control territory. Territory is occupied by populations. To truly defeat a great power, to conquer it, occupy it, and change its government, or force it to accept your terms, you ultimately need boots on the ground. You need to be able to take and hold territory. Air power and naval power are important as supporting tools, but by themselves they cannot achieve the decisive outcomes that define great power competition. You cannot bomb a country into submission and then simply leave. History has repeatedly demonstrated this. At some point, land forces have to go in and consolidate what air and naval power created. But with armies, geography comes into play. That's why large bodies of water, particularly oceans, are enormous obstacles to projecting land power, and this single geography fact shapes the entire structure of great power competition. The idea goes like this. To project land power across an ocean, you need to move armies, massive amounts of men, equipment, ammunition, vehicles, and fuel, across thousands of miles of open water. This requires enormous navy and logistical capacity. The crossing itself is vulnerable to interdiction, and when you arrive, your forces are depleted, potentially disorganized, and facing an enemy fighting on home soil with better supply lines. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans are vastly large barriers. This is why no state has ever achieved global hegemony, why no single power has ever dominated the entire world the way a state can dominate a continent. The oceans protect distant regions from conquest in a way that land borders simply cannot. Since global hegemony is essentially impossible due to the stopping power of the ocean, the realistic maximum achievement for a great power is regional hegemony, dominating your own geographic region so completely that no rival can challenge you within it. The United States is the only state in modern history to have achieved this. By the late 19th century, America had pushed European powers out of the Western Hemisphere through the Monroe Doctrine, defeated or absorbed its continental rivals, and established unchallengeable dominance over North and South America. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans once again served as enormous defensive moats protecting that hegemony from challenge. Once the US achieved regional hegemony, its strategic priority shifted. Now it needed to prevent any other state from achieving the same thing in Europe or Asia. Because a regional hegemon in this area would project potential force across the oceans and threaten American security. This is the logic behind American involvement in both World Wars and the Cold War. It wasn't ideology or morality. It was a rational calculation of a regional hegemon trying to prevent the emergence of a competitor elsewhere. This reframes the entire 20th century American foreign policy in a striking way. The US didn't enter World War I to make the world safe for democracy. It entered because a German victory would have created a European hegemon powerful enough to eventually go against American interest. The US didn't fight the Cold War purely because they hated communism. It fought because a Soviet Union that dominated Eurasia would control enough population, industrial capacity, and resources to potentially challenge American regional hegemony. I mention Eurasia specifically because it's the most strategically important landmass on Earth. It contains the majority of the world's population, the bulk of its industrial capacity, and most of its critical natural resources. Any state that could achieve hegemony over Eurasia would control a base of power that could eventually challenge even the United States. This is why Eurasia has been the central theater of great power competition throughout the past and why it remains so today. Eurasia has no natural stopping point equivalent to the oceans that protect America. The great European plain stretches from France all the way to the Ural Mountains, with few significant geographic barriers. This is why European history is full of invasions and counter-invasions. The terrain itself doesn't provide natural defensive lines the way oceans do. Napoleon could march from Paris to Moscow. The geography invites land power competition in a way that America simply do not. Russia sits at the heart of this. It is the largest country on Earth by territory, spanning 11 time zones from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. Its sheer geographic mass gives it certain inherent advantages, such as invaders faces the nightmare of extended supply lines, brutal winters, and vast distances. But the same geography also means Russia shares land borders with an enormous number of potential rivals: European states to the west, China to the east, and Central Asia to the south. Russia has historically faced potential threats from multiple directions simultaneously, which shapes its strategic psychology profoundly. The second most powerful weapon is naval power. It's critically important for several reasons. It protects trade routes and the flow of commerce that sustains modern economies. It enables power projection by allowing states to move armies across water and support them logistically. It can blockade rivals and strangle their economies, and it provides the platform for air power to operate from carriers across vast distances. But once again, naval power by itself cannot conquer territory or defeat great powers. Britain had the world's most powerful navy for much of the 19th and earlier 20th century. That navy couldn't prevent Napoleon from dominating continental Europe. Sea powers contain and limit land power, but cannot replace it. The United States emerged from World War II with both the world's most powerful army and the world's most powerful navy, backed by a nuclear monopoly and an economy that dwarfed every other country combined. That combination was historically unprecedented and explains the extent of American dominance in the post-war period. But the nuclear option is unique. Nuclear weapons represent a genuine revolution in military affairs. But there is a sharp distinction between nuclear deterrence and nuclear compliance. Deterrence means using the threat of nuclear retaliation to prevent attacks on yourself. No nuclear-armed state has ever been directly invaded by another nuclear-armed power. The mutual destruction logic holds. Compliance, on the other hand, is using nuclear threats to force other states to do something it doesn't want to do. Nuclear weapons are essentially too extreme for day-to-day use for diplomacy. You cannot credibly threaten nuclear war every time a rival does something you dislike. The threat has to be believable. And obliterating a country over a trade dispute or a border skirmish is not believable. So below the nuclear threshold, military competitions continue unimpeded. Both the USA and USSR had nuclear arsenals sufficient to destroy each other many times over. Yet they competed fiercely through proxy wars, such as Korea, Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and Central America. They built up conventional forces in Europe sufficient to fight a massive land war. They fought for influence across the developing world. Nuclear weapons prevented direct war, but they did not stop the competition. They just pushed it into another form. The geography that made Russia a great power never changed. The Eurasian landmass didn't rearrange itself in 1991. What collapsed was the Soviet economic and political system, but the framework predicts that as long as the underlying geographic and resource foundations exist, the latent power will eventually be rebuilt. So then the question becomes, how do these great powers gain control? In one way, it's really simple: war. Direct military conflict between states is the most straightforward strategy for gaining power. A state that defeats a rival in war and can strip it of territory, resources, population, and industrial capacity, it can destroy the rival's military power and remove it as a future threat. It can impose political settlements that permanently alter the balance of power. When a great power thinks that it can win a war quickly and decisively and gain more power from the victory, and do this at acceptable costs, the temptation to use military force is powerful. There are many examples of this. The wars that reshaped the great power balance, such as the Napoleonic Wars, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, both world wars were in each case driven by states making calculated bets that military force could improve their strategic position. Sometimes those bets paid off, sometimes they didn't. But the pattern of states reaching for war as a strategic instrument is constant across centuries and across ideologies. This is a direct challenge to the post-Cold War thinking that war between great powers had become obsolete. The incentive structure that produced those wars hasn't changed. What has changed is the nuclear dimension. A great power with a sufficient military advantage can sometimes achieve its goals without actually fighting, by credibly threatening force and compelling a weaker state to back down. The key word is credible. Blackmail only works if the threatened state genuinely believes that the threat will be carried out. Empty threats like a call to actually weaken the threatening state's position by exposing the bluff. Military capacity always has to be backed by demonstrated political will to matter as blackmail. A state with enormous military power but with no willingness to use it cannot effectively coerce others. But on the other hand, a state with moderate military power but demonstrated willingness to absorb cost and fight can punch above its weight coercively. Apply this to post-Cold War period. Russia and the Nazis had degraded forces but retained nuclear weapons and demonstrated in Chechnya that it was willing to fight to preserve what it considered core interest. The US had overwhelming superiority but faced domestic political constraints on its willingness to sustain casualties. This asymmetry and demonstrated will shaped the coercive dynamics between them even when the raw material balances favored America decisively. The logic is simple. You maneuver two rivals into fighting each other, allow them to exhaust and bleed each other and prolong conflicts, and then emerge stronger relative to both of them without having spent your own blood and treasure. You're not fighting, you're watching and waiting while your rivals destroy each other. The historical example is America and Soviet behavior during the early stages of conflict, where neither superpowers were directly involved. Both superpowers repeatedly found ways to keep conflicts going between their rivals or proxies rather than resolving them, because a prolonged conflict drained the other side without costing the manipulating power directly. Neither the US nor the USSR wanted direct confrontation, but both sides had strong incentives to bleed the other through proxy wars. The Soviet decision to support North Vietnam was partly about bleeding American power and will. The American decision to arm the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet invasion is a textbook example of bait and bleed, executed successfully. It's also a framework for understanding some contemporary behavior. When great powers provide weapons and support to one side in a conflict without directly intervening, bait and bleed logic is often operating beneath the surface of whatever humanitarian or democratic justification is offered publicly. Closely related to bait and bleed, with a subtle difference, is bloodletting. It doesn't require maneuvering rivals into fighting each other from scratch. It means intervening in an ongoing conflict, specifically to keep it going and maximize the damage both sides inflict on each other. Rather than allowing either side to win quickly, a quick decisive victory by one rival strengthens that rival and potentially creates a more dangerous threat. A prolonged mutual bloodletting weakens both and leaves the manipulating power in a relatively stronger position. An example of this would be the external powers' behavior during the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. The United States provided intelligence and some support to Iraq under Saddam Hussein, not because it wanted Iraq to win decisively, but because it wanted to make Iran weaken after the Islamic Revolution. When Iraq started losing, support shifted to prevent an Iranian victory. The goal wasn't a winner, it was a mutual exhaustion. Both Iraq and Iran emerged from 8 years of war with their societies devastated and their military power degraded. The superpowers that had manipulated the conflict emerged relatively stronger. But what states do when they face a rising threat rather than when they're trying to gain advantage? Balancing is the most fundamental decisive response to a rising great power. When one state starts accumulating enough power to threaten others, those other states will form coalitions to counterbalance it. The logic is straightforward. No single state may be able to stop a rising hegemon alone, but a coalition of threatened states can pool their power to check it. But there are two types of balancing: internal balancing and external. Internal balancing means building up your own military power. External means forming alliances with other states. Both are tools of the same fundamental strategy. The interesting question for the post-Cold War period is who is balancing whom. With the Soviet threat gone, NATO's original balancing purpose was fulfilled, but the alliance didn't dissolve. Instead, it expanded. This looks like the continuation of balancing behavior. The US using NATO to maintain a favorable balancing of power in Europe and prevent any potential resurgence of Russian power, even when Russia was at its weakest. Russia's behavior, building relationships with China, supporting Iran, opposing American interventions in Iraq and Libya, developing new military technologies specifically designed to counter American military, looks from this framework like classic balancing behavior by a state that perceives itself as a target of American power. Bug passing means allowing another state to bear the cost of balancing a rising threat while you stand aside and let them do the dangerous work. You're hoping someone else will stop the dangerous power before it becomes your problem to deal with directly. The logic is economically sound. If another state is going to bear the cost of checking a rising power, such as spending blood and money in a war on an arms race, why not let them do it? You preserve your own resources while the threat gets handled. If the bug catcher wins, the threat is eliminated at no cost to you. If the bug catcher loses, you may face a worse situation, but by then you've preserved your resources and can respond from a stronger position. This framework has enormous relevance to understanding contemporary great power behavior during the early stages of the Ukraine conflict starting in 2014. There was a significant debate within NATO about how much support to provide, with some states willing to pass the buck to Ukraine itself to resist Russian pressure, while preserving their own resources and avoiding direct confrontation with a nuclear power. A mentality that some states have is engagement, which is building economic and diplomatic ties with a potential rival in hopes of moderating its behavior and integrating it into the international order. This was a cornerstone of Western policy towards both Russia and China after the Cold War. The logic was that states embedded in the global economy and international institutions would have too much to lose from aggressive behavior and would gradually become the status quo powers. But the engagement can work as a short-term tool, maintaining communications, reducing misunderstandings, and finding areas of mutual interest. But as a grand strategy for fundamentally changing a great power's behavior, it has its serious limits. The argument is that engagement fails to address the structural incentives identified earlier in this video. A rising great power isn't aggressive because of miscommunication, or because it doesn't understand the benefits of trade. It pursues power because the structure of the international system makes power maximization the rational survival strategy. No amount of economic integrations changes the underlying logic. When security interest clashes with economic interest, security wins. The other method is appeasement, which is making specific concessions to a rising power in hopes of satisfying its ambitions and avoiding conflict. This distinguishes between appeasement of legitimate grievances, which can be rational, and appeasement of a state with genuine expansionist ambitions. The problem is that you often cannot tell which type you're dealing with until it's too late. What ties all these strategies together is that they all emerge from the same underlying logic. States facing an anarchic international environment with no guarantee of protection pursue survival through power maximization. The specific strategy they choose depends on their current power position, the nature of the threats they face, and the opportunities available to them. Weak states balance and seek allies. States with enough power pursue war or blackmail. States in ambitious positions may try to buck pass or engagement while building up their own capabilities. And powerful states with the ability to shape events may try bait and bleed or bloodletting to weaken rivals without direct confrontation. The crucial insight is that ideology doesn't determine which strategy they use. Democratic states use all of these strategies, as well as communist. The behavior is driven by structural position, not regime type. This is why great power competition between the USA and Russia, or the USA and China, isn't fundamentally about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about the structural competition between great powers that the international system itself generates. If you look at the actual behavior of both the US and Russia after 1991 through the lens of these strategies, the US expanded NATO right up to Russia's borders, while Russia was too weak to resist. A form of positioning that makes complete sense if you assume the competition with Russia was ongoing rather than resolved. The US intervened in former Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, Iraq, and in Libya, each intervention either containing potential rival influence or demonstrating American power. Neither side ever stopped playing the game. The 90s just happened to be a period when one player was temporarily too weak to play effectively, not because of any particular leader's personality or ideology, but because the incentives never went away. But then the question becomes, why is Russia still our enemy? If the quote Cold War ended in 1991, NATO expansion was a catastrophic strategic mistake, not because Russia's concerns were morally justified, but because expanding a military alliance to Russia's borders was always going to trigger exactly the offensive realism predicts. You don't need to sympathize with Putin to see that any Russian leader would have reacted the same way to NATO absorbing Ukraine or Georgia. The structural threat is the same regardless of who sits in the Kremlin. The West created the conditions for a renewed conflict, By treating the post-Cold War period as a permanent American victory rather than a temporary power imbalance, Western policymakers made moves such as NATO expansion and missile defense systems in Eastern Europe that were always going to be read in Moscow as consolidating American hegemony at Russia's backyard. Russia's behavior since 2008 is defensive balancing, not offensive aggression. The intervention in Georgia, the annexation of Crimea, and the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. But the situation in Ukraine needs more detail to fully understand its weight in geopolitics. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukraine became an independent state essentially overnight. In a December referendum, over 90% of Ukrainians voted for independence, including majorities in every region, including the heavily Russian-speaking East and Crimea. There was a real Ukrainian desire for sovereignty distinct from Moscow. But independence immediately raised several enormous complicated questions that were never fully resolved and that festered for the next 2 decades. The nuclear question was the most immediate. Ukraine inherited roughly 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads from the Soviet arsenal, making it overnight the third largest nuclear power on Earth. Neither the United States, Russia, nor Western Europe wanted an unstable post-Soviet republic controlling nuclear weapons. The resolution came through the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Ukraine agreed to transfer all nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for security assurances from the United States, Britain, and Russia, guaranteeing Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, Ukraine and Western governments argued Russia had violated its Budapest commitments. Russia argued the memorandum guarantees applied to the Yanukovych government that had been overthrown, not to the successor government. The legal and political argument was complex, but the strategic reality was brutally simple. Ukraine's economy was deeply integrated with Russia through Soviet-era industrial planning. Major Ukrainian industries, such as steel, chemicals, heavy machinery, and the Donbass, were built to supply the Soviet system and were dependent on Russian energy in Russian markets. The agricultural sector was potentially competitive globally, but needed massive investment. Ukraine in 1991 faced the same shock therapy economic transition as Russia, but with less institutional capacity to manage it. The result through the 90s was economic catastrophe. Ukrainian GDP collapsed by roughly 60% between 91 and 99, one of the worst economic catastrophes in peacetime history. Corruption was also everywhere, as Soviet-era managers and political connected figures seized state assets. A Ukrainian oligarch class emerged that was, if anything, even more predatory than Russia's because Ukrainian state institutions were weaker. The economic chaos of the 90s spread enormous political instability and left ordinary Ukrainians deeply alienated from their political system. But the identity question was also very important. What does it mean to be Ukrainian? The country contained people who identified primarily as Ukrainian, and other people who identified primarily as Russian, and people who felt both identities simultaneously, and people in between who might shift their primary identification depending on political circumstances. The Ukrainian language was dominant in the West, and gradually more so in the center, while Russia was the primary language of daily life in the East and South. The Orthodox Church was divided between a Moscow-aligned branch and a Kiev-aligned branch. History was contested. The Soviet famine of 1932 and 33, the Holodomor, was understood as a deliberate genocide of the Ukrainian people by the Soviet state in western Ukraine and by many Ukrainians nationally, while many Russians and some eastern Ukrainians understood it differently. The Western analysis of Ukraine constantly underestimated the depth and sincerity of these divisions. The first major turning point after independence came in 2004. The Ukrainian election of 2004, which pitted Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian candidate backed by the outgoing president Leonid Kuchma and supported by Moscow, against Viktor Yushchenko, who favored closer ties with the EU and NATO. The election was marred by massive fraud in the favor of Yanukovych, triggering enormous street protests in Kiev that became known as the Orange Revolution. The Ukrainian Supreme Court annulled the results, and a new election was held, and Yanukovych won. From the Western perspective, this was a straightforward story of Ukrainian democracy triumphing over Russian-backed electoral manipulation. From Moscow's perspective, it looked very different. A Western-backed political operation designed to install a pro-NATO government in the most strategically important country on Russia's border. Both perspectives contain truth, but what happened after the Orange Revolution, which is largely ignored in Western accounts because it complicates the narrative. Yushchenko's presidency was a political and economic disaster. His coalition with fellow Orange leader Yulia Tymoshenko collapsed in bitter fighting. Economic reform stalled. Corruption, if anything, intensified. Ukraine's economy was battered by the 2008 global financial crisis, and in 2010, president election conducted freely and fairly. Ukrainians elected Viktor Yanukovych, the same man they had rejected in 2004. This outcome was enormously significant. It was almost entirely ignored in Western coverage. Ukrainian voters in a free election chose the pro-Russian candidate, not because they were manipulated or coerced, but because the pro-Western Orange coalition had governed badly and failed to deliver the promised improvements in ordinary Ukrainian lives. The democratic process produced an outcome that contradicted the Western narrative, that Ukraine's natural democracy will point towards Europe. Running alongside the political drama throughout the 2000s was a series of conflict over natural gas. Ukraine was almost entirely dependent on Russian natural gas for its energy needs, and it was also the transit country in which Russian gas flowed to Western Europe. This created an extraordinary complex three-way relationship between Russia as supplier, Ukraine as transit state and consumer, and Western Europe as the ultimate consumer. Russia and Ukraine fought disputes over gas prices and transit fees in 2006 and again in 2009 that resulted in Russia cutting off gas supplies and afflicting deliveries to Western Europe. The Western narrative presented this cutoffs as Russian energy blackmail, using gas as a geopolitical weapon to punish Ukraine for its pro-Western orientation and intimidate Western European governments. Russia used energy leverage for political purposes, but Ukraine was also consistently failing to pay for gas at agreed prices and was siphoning gas intended for Western Europe to cover its own needs, which gave Russia legitimate grievances alongside whatever political motivations they had. The situation was complicated, and the clean narrative of Russian aggression versus Ukrainian victimhood didn't capture the reality. What the gas wars did accomplish was to make European energy dependent on Russia's major political issue, accelerating European interest in alternative suppliers and routes, and reinforcing the argument that Ukraine's geopolitical orientation had enormous practical consequences for European energy security. This made Ukraine's alignment question not just a matter of Ukrainian sovereignty, but a central European strategic concern. But another big event that would happen between Russia and Ukraine is the Maidan Revolution and its aftermath. The sequence began in November 2013, when President Yanukovych suspended negotiations over the EU Association Agreement and accepted Russia's competing offer of a $15 billion loan and reduced gas prices. This triggered protests in Kiev that began as relatively small demonstrations by pro-EU Ukrainians frustrated with the president's refusal. Over the following weeks, the protests grew dramatically, and their character changed. What began as a pro-EU demonstration evolved into a broader anti-government movement encompassing Ukrainians with many different grievances against the government, such as corruption, authoritarianism, and economic mismanagement. In February 2014, the situation escalated dramatically. Snipers fired on both protesters and police in the Maidan, killing dozens, an event that remains genuinely contested in terms of who ordered it and why. Yanukovych fled to Russia. A new interim government was formed from opposition leaders. But the American side needs to be looked at. There are leaked phone calls between Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and Ambassador Geoffrey Payette, in which Nuland discussed specific Ukrainian politicians and who should and shouldn't be in the new government. And Nuland's own acknowledgement that the U.S. had invested $5 billion in Ukrainian's democratic development over 2 decades, and the Russian annexation of Crimea in March was presented in virtually all Western coverage as unprovoked imperial aggression. Crimea had been a part of Russia from its conquest from the Ottoman Empire in 1783 until 1954, when Nikita Khrushchev transferred it from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic, a decision that had no practical significance while both Russia and Ukraine were part of the same Soviet state, but became enormously consequential when the USSR dissolved. Most importantly for Russian strategic calculation, Sevastopol in Crimea is a home port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Under a basing agreement with Ukraine, the Black Fleet is Russia's primary naval access to the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and beyond. It's not an exaggeration to say that Sevastopol is to Russian naval power what Pearl Harbor is to American naval power in the Pacific. From Moscow's perspective, the sequence of events in early 2014 presented an existential threat. A Western-backed government had just taken power in Kiev. The government included figures who had experienced hostility to the Russian basing agreement in Crimea. NATO membership for Ukraine, which the new government immediately began expressing interest in, would potentially mean a NATO military presence in Sevastopol. The possibility of Russia's Black Sea Fleet being expelled from its primary base by a NATO-aligned Ukrainian government was, from Moscow's perspective, an existential threat that overrode all other considerations, including international law. There's also something Western coverage ignored. A referendum was held in Crimea in March, in which an overwhelming majority voted for joining Russia. The referendum was conducted under Russian military occupation and didn't meet international standards for legitimacy, but consistent polling data going back years before the crisis showing majority support in Ukraine for closer ties with Russia, the referendum result probably reflected something real about Crimean public opinion. After Crimea, the conflict spread to the Donbass, the heavily industrialized eastern Ukrainian region, Donetsk and Luhansk. The Donbass conflict began in 2014, when pro-Russian separatist movements emerged in Donetsk and Luhansk declared independence as the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic, and began armed conflict with the Ukrainian government of forces. Russia provided support to the separatists, with military equipment, volunteers, and eventually regular Russian military units operating without official insignia. The Western narrative presented this as straightforward Russian military aggression. The separatist movement in the Donbass had genuine roots in the local population, alarm at the events in Ukraine. The new post-Maidan government's initial moves, including a parliamentary vote to remove Russian as an official language, subsequently vetoed but widely reported in eastern Ukraine. This triggered real fear among Russian-speaking communities about their status in the new Ukraine. For Russia, Ukraine is not simply a neighboring country. It is, in Putin's words, and in the words of many Russians across the political spectrum, part of the core of Russian civilization. Historically, culturally, and strategically, losing Ukraine to a hostile Western-aligned bloc is not, from Moscow's perspective, like losing Poland or Hungary. It's existential in a way that these countries are not. And it is crucial that this view is not unique to Putin. It is shared across the Russian political spectrum, including by liberals, Democrats, who otherwise oppose Putin on democratic issues. Any Russian government, democratic or authoritarian, would resist NATO membership for Ukraine. For the United States, Ukraine is not actually a vital interest in the way it is for Russia. No American government before the 90s treated Ukraine as a core strategic concern. The United States survived and thrived for its entire history without Ukraine being in any particular geopolitical alignment. The American interest in Ukraine's orientation is real, but it is a strategic preference. It's about extending the liberal international order, not an existential necessity. This asymmetry of interest is the most dangerous element of the situation. When one side considers an issue existential and the other considers it merely important, the conditions for catastrophic miscalculation are extreme. The side for whom the issue is existential would take risk and absorb costs that the other side cannot rationally anticipate. But because from the outside those risks and costs look disproportional to any rational level of interest, the example of Ukraine is impossible without understanding it as an episode in an ongoing great power competition that never genuinely resolved in 1991. And as America continues to give money and aid to Ukraine, this will just prolong the war, which will ultimately cost more lives. And if Ukraine loses, then America would have lost all their investment in Ukraine. So to answer the question, did the Cold War end in 1991? Well, yes and no. Yes, the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism did end in 1991. The Soviet Union generally collapsed, the communist ideology failed in its goal, and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. This was real. But underneath the ideological conflict was always a deeper competition that didn't end. The competition between the United States as the world's dominant power and Russia as a major Eurasian power was not created by communism. It was not resolved by communism's defeat. It will persist regardless of what political system Russia adopts, because it's driven by geography, power, and the logic of the international system, rather than by ideology. The 90s were not the end of the rivalry. They were a window of American dominance during which Russia was temporarily too weak to contest American moves. NATO expansion and the enlargement of the EU eastward, these were all moves made during a window when Russia couldn't push back. The moment Russia recovered its economic and military power, the pushback began. Thank you for watching till the end. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments below. If you like this type of content, subscribe for future videos.